Hello, everyone. This is Independent Conservative. Thank you all for joining me once again. A few days ago, someone made the suggestion in the commentary section of my video, one of my videos, to do a book recommendation because they had admired the books that I have oftentimes sitting up over my head here. They really admired the book collection, and I let them know. I said, well, thank you very much. And so they suggested to do a video on some book recommendations, and I really thought about that because what's interesting about that suggestion is that I had thought about doing a video on book suggestions some time ago. And in fact, I actually had read an excerpt from one of Thomas Sowell's books about a year ago, actually. And I had read a few excerpts from his book to point out a particular fact. So by virtue of the fact that this individual suggested this to me was very intriguing indeed. And so I'm honored to want to do that. Now, in this particular video, this is exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to recommend 3 particular books from my collection of Thomas Sowell books. These are going to be books written by Thomas Sowell, who is a economist and social theorist. He's one of the greatest social theorists, according to some critics, of our century, one of the greatest of our century. I mean, that's what really stands. That's the one particular area of expertise that Thomas Sowell tends to stand out is social theory. That's one of the biggest ones, particular fields of expertise that he tends to stand out in. And so that's what the books that I'm going to recommend to you guys really focuses on: social theory, how people interrelate with each other in terms of race relations and so forth. And so I'm going to be doing that. Now, periodically throughout this recommendation, I'm going to be reading some particular excerpts from his books to point out certain factual data that Thomas Sowell held that is being held today by many conservatives and many liberals. And the reason for that is because a lot of people say, well, man, you conservatives are this and you conservatives are that. Failing to realize is that there are some highly educated conservatives out there, Thomas Sowell being one of them, that really has the same views, okay? People get on, once again, I mentioned Charlie Kirk. People get on Charlie Kirk. They don't like him, this, that, and the other. But if you really listen to Charlie Kirk's statements and criticisms and debates on college campuses, once again, as I said before, a lot of what Charlie Kirk said lines up in many ways with what Thomas Sowell has said in his books years ago. I mean, even before Charlie Kirk was around, okay? Thomas Sowell is a very accomplished individual. He's very accomplished. As a matter of fact, one particular book that I wanted to, that I'm not going to recommend necessarily, but I'm much going to show, well, you know what, I'm going to recommend it, but I'm not going to read any excerpts from it, okay? I'm going to recommend this book to you, but I want to point out something about what the book actually focuses on, okay? So, and here it is. This is actually a biography. Oftentimes I'll have this book written over here, but this is I'm sorry, not a biography, but an autobiography of Thomas Sowell's accomplishments. Now, it's written by another conservative commentator and economist by the name of Jason L. Riley, who is another conservative commentator that I really admire. And he wrote this book back in 2020. So I'm going to add this. Let me tell you this. I'm going to add this recommendation to you guys as well. This is a excellent book that highlights Thomas Sowell's accomplishments, his economic accomplishments and his social theory accomplishments. It's not so much not autobiography. It's not an autobiography. What am I saying? It's not so much a biography on his life necessarily as much as it is a biography on his accomplishments. This book is excellent because it really highlights those things that Thomas Sowell was good at. So I do recommend this book, written by Jason A. Riley. If you want to know about Thomas Sowell's accomplishments from the beginning to the end, I highly recommend this book. Once again, Thomas Sowell is a highly highly decorated man. I think he's written over 40 something books, and I have a little over 20 of them. So, 20 of his books. So, and the books that you see behind me, although those are the books I'm not going to necessarily talk about in detail, are from Thomas Sowell, okay, as well as the ones, obviously, that I would usually have over me in back of me as usual. But let's get right into our discussion, because I think that you will, those of you who may perhaps want to increase your book collections, these are books that I highly recommend, books that I've actually read practically all the way through just about. And the first book that I'm going to recommend is the book Dismantling America by Thomas Sowell. Dismantling America. This book was written in 2010. Okay, he wrote this book in 2010. And let me explain essentially what this book actually is. Really, this book, Dismantling America, written in 2010, is really a compilation of many of Thomas Sowell's articles. Okay, it's a compilation of many of his articles, because what it essentially focuses on is, as you see here, the preface is particular. Let's see here. It focuses on government policies. Well, you can't see it here. Government policies, political issues, economic issues, cultural issues, and legal issues. Okay, so this particular book here, Dismantling America, are a compilation of many of Thomas Sowell's articles preceding 2010 up to 2010. And he talks about a lot of things in this book that if you were to read this book and read these particular exposés on political issues and cultural issues, you'd be like, wait a minute, isn't that what the left and right is talking about today? Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I'm going to read a particular excerpt out of this particular book that will sound very familiar to you, okay? I just want to give you a hint. If you don't have this book, I just want to give you a hint of some of the topics that Thomas Sowell touches on here that sounds oddly familiar today, okay? So this is the particular section dealing with legal issues. Okay, this is the particular section dealing with legal issues, and it's entitled The Left and Crime and How Liberals Think About Crime. You already know where I'm going with this, okay? Oh, and by the way, obviously, this particular video is going to be an extended video. It's going to be longer, obviously, than most of my other videos, because I really want you guys to get the crust of what I'm trying to encourage those who don't have Thomas Sowell's books to do. You know, if you really want to dig a little bit deeper and dig a little bit deeper, then get that red pill, and I'll show you how far the rabbit hole goes, okay? Or rather, I'd say this: Thomas Sowell will show you how far the rabbit hole goes. So this is what Thomas Sowell says about the left and crime. I'm just going to read you a little bit of this. And remember once again, this is in 2010 when he was saying this. Oakland, California continues to suffer the high crime rate, and especially the higher murder rate, which has been long afflicted that city. Judging by a recent speech by its current mayor, longtime leftist Ron Dulums, it can now look forward to a future all too much like its past. Why is Oakland so crime-ridden? According to Mayor Dulums, quote, "We have closed our eyes to the injustices and any inequities, and now we are reaping the wild winds of that disregard for a whole range of people." In other words, this man in 2010, which is a leftist, is spitting the same stuff liberals spit all the time. They argue that high crime, liberal politicians, and liberal academia argue that high crime in inner cities, regardless of who it is, okay, is the cause of inequities and injustices permitted against these people. And because of these inequities and because of these injustices and because these people are oppressed, basically what he's arguing, they commit these crimes. The same mantra that the left repeats all the time. Let's go on. This is the root cause causes of crime rhetoric of the 1960s, still going strong on the left today, despite mountains of evidence to the contrary that have accumulated in the decades since then. And Thomas Sowell have oftentimes been criticized and put down for this because as an economist, as a social theorist, he never went along the lines of what many of his liberal peers were doing. And so he was considered an outcast. But I ain't going to go into the detail of that. You guys can purchase that book from Jason L. Riley about Thomas Sowell and his accomplishments and many of the things, much of the opposition that he actually suffered from his leftist peers. You can read that in that book there. But anyway, this is what makes Oakland's problem more than just Oakland's problem or even American problem. The same kind of thinking prevails on the left in other countries, producing the same kind of dire results. Let's see what he has to say. As British writer Peter Hickens put it, quote, England is rapidly becoming a place where the good are afraid of the bad and the bad are not afraid of anything. He also said, the sheer concrete-headed stupidity of most political statements about crime defies belief. Both statements would apply as much in Oakland as they do in London and in many other places in between. So I want to read you this part here. The idea that injustices and inequities explain crime goes back more than 2 centuries. Interesting, right? You can find it in William Godwin's 1793 book, Inquiry Concerning Political Justice in England, and even earlier in a number of writers in France. It is the hallmark of the left around the world. So this whole idea, this is how the left thinks all the time. They blame crime, people committing crimes on these foolish inequities and all the rest, inequities and injustices. And let's be realistic. A significant number of people in England at this time were what? White. They weren't black. So it's not a racial thing. It's a mind thing. But let's go on. While such ideas have been around for centuries, they did not become the dominant ideas among those making legal and political policy until the second half of the 20th century, more specifically the 1960s in the United States. You guys have noticed that I say that a lot in some of my videos. I always go back to the 1960s, 1960s so-called counterculture revolution. It ain't what people think what it was. It really wasn't what people thought it was. Oh my God, it was just so, no, it's a little bit more going on in the 1960s than what people think. Thomas Sowell goes to say, what was crime like in 1960? What was crime like in the 1960s before these ideas took over in our courts, in the legislative and executive branches of government? As of 1960, the murder rate had been going down for decades. Oh, really, Thomas Sowell? Let's read on. Among blacks and whites alike, and was just under half of what it had been back in 1934. Were there no injustices and inequities in 1960 and the prior decades? No one who was old enough to remember those times could believe that. And Thomas Sowell certainly did, because the man is in his 90s right now. Okay, it was precisely the rise to power in the 1960s, in the courts as well as in politics, of those who believed that injustices and inequities were the cause of crime, which marked a de-emphasis on law enforcement and imprisonment and marked one of the most dramatic increases in crime in our history. Having declined for decades on end, the murder rate suddenly doubled between 1961 and 1974. Gee, really? But the left will tell you, something opposite. What? The rates at which citizens became victims of violent crimes in general tripled. I ain't going to read too much more. That's all. Let's give you a taste of what you will be headed for when you purchase this book, Dismantling America, written in 2010 by Thomas Sowell. And like I said, it's a compilation of many of his articles throughout the years that he's compiled it in one book. I highly recommend this book if you do not have it. I highly recommend it because even though it was written in 2010, it really is very prophetic in many different ways. It's very prophetic, okay? Dismantling America, highly recommend it. It will open your eyes. The second book I wanted to recommend here, and actually I should have recommended this book first because this is the book that got me into the Thomas Sowell thing, okay? This was the book. And some of you might have this book by Thomas Sowell, okay? It is Black Rednecks and White Liberals. Black Rednecks and White Liberals. Wow. This book was written in 2005. And essentially, as the title says, Black Rednecks and White Liberals, this book flips the whole narrative on slavery. Remember how the left oftentimes makes this argument that, going back to the crime thing, that high crime and poverty and all these type of things is the direct result of slavery. Thomas Sowell argues in this book that ain't really what it that's not completely what it is. He argues in his book. This book is the book that got me really, really into the Thomas Sowell thing right here. This book here is, oh my goodness. If you don't have it, this book will really take you down the rabbit hole of slavery and racism and all of the rest. You know, one of the arguments that the left makes is that America created slavery, which really is the stupidest, dumbest thing the left could ever do. Anybody with any kind of sense, you don't even have to have any understanding of history or any remote knowledge of history to know that America did not create slavery. Come on, man. The left tends to truncate everything negative to America, as if America is the one that is the cause of all the evils and injustices in the world. Boo-boo. The world existed and other countries existed before America was even thought about. And they were committing some of the most atrocious, horrible things to human beings that one could even remotely imagine. America had nothing to do with it. Slavery was around thousands of years before America became a country. Anybody that has any kind of sense of history should know that, okay? These are one of the things that Thomas Sowell argues in this book. And I just want to read a small excerpt out of it to give you a taste, if you do not have this book, a taste of what you're going to be, what you're going to get into if you purchase this book. I recommend you purchase these books, okay? All right, so I'm going to read you just a small excerpt from this book. Okay, here's one particular excerpt from the chapter, The Real History of Slavery. And let me point this out once again. I don't think I pointed it out. This book was written in 2005. 2005, okay? That's what he says about the real history of slavery. Just a small smidgen. It takes no more research than the trip to almost any public library or college library to show the incredibly lopsided coverage of slavery in the United States or in the Western Hemisphere, as compared to the meager writings on the even larger number of Africans enslaved in the Islamic countries of the Middle East and North Africa, not to mention the vast number of Europeans also enslaved in centuries past in the Islamic world and within Europe itself. At least 1 million Europeans were enslaved by North African pilots alone from 1500 to 1800. So this was during the transatlantic slave trade, which is what the left likes to focus on all the time, right? I personally believe that the left does that because it's part of their Marxist ideology. Keep everybody divided in order to incite a revolution, a Marxist communist revolution, and get groups at each other. So I personally believe that the left focuses on American slavery and the transatlantic slave trade to keep everybody divided. Oh, it's America. America had the worst. They were just evil. Failing to realize that during the same period, according to Thomas Sowell's research, from 1500 to 1800, okay, let's read that again. The vast number of Europeans also enslaved in centuries past in the Islamic world and within Europe itself. At least 1 million Europeans were enslaved by North African pirates alone from 1500 to 1800. You'll never hardly hear anything about that now, will you? Those of us that were in school, what were we always hearing? American slaves. American slaves. Americans, white men, enslaved black. Ooh, that's all we would hear. And what would that do? It would enrage black people and make white people feel guilty and horrible. Although they had nothing to do with the slave masters and so forth in the slave trade during the 1500s and 1800s, had nothing to do with it. They would sit in class feeling bad, and blacks would sit up in class mad at white people in the class. That was the whole point, to keep you divided. That's communism. That's Marxism, to foment a revolution. I believe that was the issue. But anyway, I digress. He goes on to say, and some European slaves were still being sold on the auction blocks in Egypt years after the Emancipation Proclamation freed blacks in the United States. Let's say that again. And some European slaves were still being sold on the auction block in Egypt years after the Emancipation Proclamation freed blacks in the United States. Interesting. Indeed, an Anglo-Egyptian treaty of August 4th, 1877 prohibited the continued sale of white slaves after August 3rd, 1885, as well as prohibiting the import and export of Sudanese and Abasian slaves. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Listen to this. During the Middle Ages, Slavs were Slavs, and please forgive me, Slavs. I think it's called Slavs. During the Middle Ages, Slavs were so widely used as slaves in both Europe and the Islamic world that the very word slave derived from the word for Slav, not only in English, but also in other European languages as well as in Arabic. Nor have Asians been exempt from either being enslaved or enslaving others. China, in centuries past, has been described as, quote, one of the largest and most comprehensive markets for the exchange of human beings in the world, end quote. Slavery was also common in India, where it had been estimated that there were more slaves than in the entire Western Hemisphere. And when the original thugs kidnapped children for the purpose of, and where the original thugs kidnapped children for the purpose of enslavement. In some of the cities of Southeast Asia, slaves were a majority of the population. Slavery was also an established institution in the Western Hemisphere before Columbus ships ever appeared on the horizon. The Ottoman Empire regularly enslaved a percentage of the young boys from the Balkans, converted them to Islam, and assigned them to various duties in the civil or military establishment. This is just one of the excerpts here, or passages here, that will take you down a rabbit hole about slavery. And he really, this book just blew me away, man. I'm just honest. This is one of my favorite Thomas Sowell books. Black rednecks and white liberals. Wow. One of my favorite books, actually my favorite books from him. I love this book. This book, it just blew me away. I highly recommend this book. Now, let me say this. Some people may argue and say, well, yeah, Mr. Bolin, he said that about slavery, and there was slavery all over in other countries, and groups were, nationalities were committing acts of slavery as well as Europeans. But what their argument, the left's argument is that American slavery was the most oppressive. It was the most worst, and the worst one that ever took place. And it was like 400 years. Thomas Sowell, I believe, argues in this book. Now this is going to, now listen, I'm going to say this, I'm going to share this, and I'm going to share Thomas Sowell's, some of his research, not all of his research. I'm going to share some of his research in his book that he mentions. That argument doesn't really stand on solid ground about America's form of slavery. I think it's called chattel slavery, as the worst form of slavery. So therefore, America's form of slavery stands out from everybody else. Yeah, it was all, the left will acknowledge the fact that there was slavery all over before American slavery and European slavery. They'll acknowledge that, but they'll try to make American slavery as the worst form of slavery. First of all, let's look at the amount of years. Islamic slavery took place in the 7th century AD. 700 years AD, right? And that's when Islamic slavery, and I'm not going to get into the details of that, when under Muhammad, no offense, began to enslave North Africans and so forth. That took place hundreds of years before the transatlantic slave trade, which started in the 1500s. In other words, Islamic slavery was hundreds of years before the transatlantic slave trade of Africans, and was just as brutal, if not more brutal, than the American slavery, and it lasted longer. Whereas American slavery was like maybe 300 something years, maybe 400, maybe 300 years, close 400. Islamic slavery was over 700 years at the very least of black people. I'm just saying. So, which one? Which one is it? But you will never hear that in the public school. It's all about American slavery. It's all about the white man. He just so oppressive, and American slavery just mess up black people. And the reason why we killing one another, and we killing one another, and we just don't love one another, and we just robbing one another, and all this kind of stuff, and poverty, and because of slavery. Man, come on, man. I think just a cursory walk through history will show you that that's bogus at the very least. Check this book out. It may offend some people, but I think the only people that's going to be offended by this book are people, in my opinion, that don't want the truth. When you don't want the truth and you want to hang on to a narrative or a mindset or an ideology that you've been holding on to all your life, and it makes you comfortable, when someone challenges that mindset, when someone challenges that narrative, when someone challenges that worldview, that person gets offended because it makes them uncomfortable. Because deep down inside, I said this before, deep down inside, they know there is some truth to what's being said. This book would do just that. Okay. Yeah, it is what it is. It is what it is. So yeah, it is what it is. So I'm going to recommend one more book to you guys, and then we're going to go on. So let's go on. And finally, this book I highly recommend, written in 2016 by Thomas Sowell, Wealth, Poverty, and Politics. And this book is exactly about that. Wealth, poverty, and politics. Taken from the perspective of a conservative economist and a conservative social theorist. Now, the section that I'm going to read to you, and this is a great book. Thomas Sowell covers a lot of topics that it goes against the norm. It goes against the liberal mantra. And a lot of people don't know this because all they're listening to is CNN and MSNBC and their liberal Marxist professors in the school, and they think they're being educated, but they're actually being dumbed down by these Marxist professors and these Marxist teachers that infiltrated our country decades ago in order not to educate you, but to deconstruct the American history platform, to deconstruct it and recreate it into the image that they want. And that image is the American founders were all a bunch of racists that wanted to destroy black people and people that don't look like them and enslave them and destroy them and all this other type of stuff, and to demonize America once again. That's a Marxist tactic in order to keep us divided. This particular book, once again, combats that stream of thought. And Thomas Sowell covers all types of topics in this book, such as why certain countries, particularly in the third world countries, particular countries in Africa and so forth, that are still behind in terms of economic process, technological advances. And he argues in this book that he written in 2016 that one of the primary reasons for that isn't because of what the left often says, well, white countries and Western countries are holding back all these things because they're racist against black countries. It's because of the land of those particular countries. It's hard to get advancements over there. but also the political regimes that run many of these African countries. They don't want anything from Europe. They don't want anything from the West, so they reject it and they push back. Now, not all African countries are doing that. Okay, some African, I think it was Nigeria and others, that take these type of I would say free trade benefits, if you will, for lack of a better word. They take it and they're like, look, I want to be up on top technologically and economically. Share these benefits with me, Europe. Share these benefits with us, America. We want it, but many of the African countries reject that. So one of the reasons why they're still behind, as Thomas Sowell argues in this book, is because of the government and what they want and what they don't want. Okay, among other things. But I want to read an excerpt out of this because this ties into what I was talking about earlier. And this particular section deals with the welfare state. The welfare state. And you already know where that's going. Okay. And I want to read this and just check this out. This is what Thomas Sowell says. He says the unemployment rate among blacks, 16 and 17-year-old males in 1948 was just under 10%. The last year in which it was under 10% was 1953. But in later years, as the minimum wage rate was repeatedly raised to keep up with inflation, unemployment among blacks in this age group never again fell below 20%. From 1971 through 1994, the unemployment rate among black 16 and 17-year-old males never fell below 30% and exceeded 40% in 9 of those years, while 50% was exceeded twice. From 1995 on, the 16, 17-year-old male category was consolidated into a new 16, 19-year-old male category. Unemployment for this new category ranged from a low of 23.8% to a high of 52.2% from 1995 through 2009. And let me say this real quick before I read the rest of this excerpt from this page. I know a lot of people get bothered by numbers and statistics and, oh, come on, man, with the numbers and statistics. But it is what it is, okay? The left gives number and statistics as well. But what the left tends to do is they tend to cover up and veil the real reasons behind why it's that way, okay? Why is it that so many blacks then, as Thomas Sowell mentions here, and now are still below the poverty line, are still making far less than their white peers, are still below when it comes to education? Why is that? Is it systemic racism? Is it white supremacy, or is it something else? Thomas Sowell goes on, despite complications in trying to determine empirically the effects of minimum wage laws on the unemployment rate of black teenage males, when their unemployment rates under minimum wages rates that kept going up along with inflation have far more than half a century been some multiple of what their unemployment rate was when inflation rendered the official minimum wage rate ineffective. The results are too blatant to be ignored and evaded. Now listen to this. He says, empirical evidence has likewise seldom been mentioned by those who make a common claim, advanced by Kristof among many others, that, quote, slavery and post-slavery oppression left a legacy of broken families among blacks. This is basically what the left argues. But Thomas Sowell goes on to say, but the plain fact is that the proportion of black children living with only one parent was never as great during the first 100 years after slavery as it became in the first 35 years after the great expansion of the welfare state beginning in the 1960s. What happened? Let's go on. Yet the legacy of slavery argument continues to be blithely repeated, and the legacy of the welfare state ignored. As in all too many other contexts, facts have not made a dent on the prevailing vision. Indeed, the very thought that this often repeated phrase should be subjected to empirical tests seems not to have occurred to many who are content to simply continue to repeat the phrase. And I could go on, but I'm not, because then that would just take away you going down a rabbit hole, okay? This book, I believe, would take you exceedingly down the rabbit hole as well. I highly recommend this book by Thomas Sowell, written in 2016, Wealth, Poverty, and Politics. That's just some of the information. Yeah. That's my list of recommendations of Thomas Sowell books. Like I said, I'm not trying to be biased about this, but it is what it is. Most of my books, I say, if not all of my books that I'm going to periodically do recommendations on in the future, are all conservative. Okay. Now, someone that's watching this may say, well, why don't you recommend some liberal books? Are you serious? I'm sorry. First of all, I'm conservative. I'm not a liberal. Let me just put that out there. I was liberal in my 20s and 30s and all the rest. I became a conservative politically in 2016, Trump's first presidency. That's when I became a conservative on the political side. And when I became a conservative on the political side, my eyes not only opened in politics, but they were opened in other areas of history. And I found out and started discovering that everything that liberals was telling me, I would say 99.9% of things that liberals were telling me when I converted to the conservative side politically, was that it was a lie for the most part, to a large extent, or there were things that the left was leaving out that they weren't talking about in the schools and on TV and in my home, and mom and dad weren't talking about it. I'm like, wait a minute, something. So when I converted over to the conservative side in 2016, at least on a political level, that political conversion allowed me to go down the rabbit hole of history, and I began to study history, and my eyes were opened up from a conservative historical perspective, and I'm like, oh my goodness, is this what slavery was? For example, on the conservative side, what the liberals like to always say is that, the whites are the evil, and they it's in their DNA that they're racist, which is really silly, because a lot of these liberals that say this type of stuff are white themselves. So you saying as a white professor that whites are inherently evil, inherently racist, it's in their DNA. Well, if it's in their DNA, wouldn't that be in your DNA too, white liberal professor? These people are so stupid. I'm sorry. They're stupid. They stupid. I'm not taking, I'm not sorry. I'm not taking it back. These professors and comedy, they're stupid, but then they're not stupid. They're stupid because they'll sit up here and say this kind of mess, but then one thing, it applies to you as well. But anyway, I digress. When I started looking through this from the perspective of history, from the perspective of the conservative side, my eyes were open to things that was just like, what? What? There were black slave holders during slavery? Over 2,000 black slave holders. And that's nothing compared to the white slave holders, but still you had them. It's, according to some researchers, it's documented in the documents. They have access to these documents. These conservative professors have access to these documents, so they're able to bring this stuff up. Anyway, so I found that out. Then I also found out from another black conservative economist by the name of Walter Williams. I think he died in 2015. And he talked about how during slavery, there was quite a few black slave business owners, not slave owners themselves, but business entrepreneurs during slavery. Now, that doesn't lessen the evils of American slavery. The American slavery was and is considered to be, and it is, one of the most oppressive forms of slavery. It was very, very oppressive because it attacked blacks psychologically, particularly at that time. So that doesn't lessen American slavery. It doesn't, and I'm not trying to lessen it. But at the same time, why would you omit those factual data, liberal professors? Why would you omit those type of things? I'll tell you why, in my opinion, because they want to demonize America, like liberals and communists do in every country they infiltrate. They demonize their country's history. They demonize their country's culture. They demonize everything about that country and the founders of that country in order to deconstruct it and create it in their communist image. That's the same mantra that the communist insurgents have been doing for decades. They ain't stopped. That's my opinion. So anyway, yeah, but I highly recommend these books. And I believe there'll be a benefit from everyone that decides to want to purchase them. So yeah, so what do you guys think about this? These excerpts, leave your comments in the comment section below, like, share, and subscribe to my channel. God bless you all. See you again.